The idea of this final module is to gain an understanding of intercultural communication, which is part of the process of language acquisition. In this module, you'll get an overview about different dimensions of cross-cultural communication, including various aspects of nonverbal, verbal, and paraverbal communication. We will also look at several sources of potential misunderstandings and barriers for communication. Many people believe that the process of learning a new language is mainly concerned with learning vocabulary, learning how to pronounce and spell words correctly, and how to apply grammatical rules accurately. While this is absolutely essential, of course, learning a new language always goes beyond these purely linguistic aspects. The way we speak and communicate is influenced very much by our outlook on life and the other way around. Our outlook on life is also influenced by the language we speak. In other words, our culture and the social context we live in influences the way we use language. Therefore, we can say that culture is a vital part of language learning. There is basically no way to avoid teaching culture when teaching language. They always go together, like two sides of a coin. The way we communicate is based on norms and conventions in our speech communities, although the way we express meaning is strongly influenced by our culture. In English, for example, new words are coined all the time to express new objects or new cultural concepts or new phenomena. Just think of expressions like text messages, crowdfunding, upcycling, or binge watching when people watch a large number of TV shows or TV series. Or think of a word such as mortarboard, a graduation cap that is so much linked to a graduation ceremony in the US or in Britain that is almost untranslatable into other languages. German, like all other languages, also has numerous compounds which help to express certain cultural meanings. For example, the word Fernweh, which literally means far away woe, and refers to a longing to travel to faraway places. Fernweh is also the opposite of Heimweh, which literally means homesickness. Or the word Kopfkino, which literally means head cinema. This word is often used when somebody gets some information and then imagines a full scenario or film based on this information, often something rather unpleasant which has happened. There are also lots of idioms and proverbs which show that cultures often have similar meanings and concepts, but at the same time also slightly different ways of expressing meaning. For example, the English phrase to behave like a bull in a china shop is expressed in German, Spanish, or French by the phrase to behave like an elephant in a china shop. Cultures may also perform certain speech acts in different ways. For example, how people say hello or goodbye, how they apologize or criticize each other, how they complain or how they make requests. A non-smoking sign can be expressed in German, for example, by the phrase Rauchen verboten. That is literally smoking is forbidden, while in English you often find the phrase thank you for not smoking. The function is the same in both cases, but in German an explicit order is used, whereas in English, by thanking someone for not smoking, you use a more indirect way and possibly even a more friendly and polite approach. Politeness routines may be expressed in different ways in different cultures, even very basic ones like saying hello and asking for a person's well-being. For example, the basic greeting, "How are you?" in Britain or the US is typically followed by the phrase "fine, thanks," or "I'm good, thanks." This is often seen as a simple way of saying hello or the start of a conversation on other topics, and it has become such a standardized phrase that you may even reply in a positive way, even if you do not feel fine or good. Of course, this short exchange may be the same on many occasions in German too. But if you meet a friend who you haven't met for quite a while, the same question is often seen as an open invitation to tell the other person what has happened to you recently, what is on your mind in general. In other words, it's often seen as a real question about your well-being, not just a politeness routine. Other examples are text genres, which may again vary from culture to culture. For example, recipes, death announcements, personal ads, fairy tales, contracts, or CVs. Such genres often follow certain structures and conventions that have developed over a long time. These examples show that language and culture are strongly interrelated, and that the way we use language or how we interact with other people is strongly influenced by our social context and by our outlook on the world around us. Some of the aspects of communication might in fact be quite similar, in particular between cultures that are pretty close to one another. But even in those cases, it can be quite risky sometimes to assume that the rules of communications are universal, when in fact differences may exist. Various disciplines like linguistics, for example, anthropology or business communication, therefore study the many ways how culture may influence our communicative behavior. Intercultural or cross-cultural communication is also interested in the way how people from different cultures interact with each other. One of the objectives is to identify potential communication problems which may lead to misunderstandings or even failure in communication. In a second step, the idea is to make language learners aware of these potential problems to avoid such misunderstandings. Cross-cultural communication is concerned with numerous socio-cultural categories of communicative behavior, so-called culturemes, a term which was introduced by Els Oxner in the late 1980s, and with 4 different dimensions of intercultural communication, which will be presented on the next slide. The most obvious dimension in which cultures may differ is verbal communication, of course, but there are also nonverbal, paraverbal, and extraverbal aspects where cultures may be different. In the following, I will briefly present all 4 dimensions based on a few examples, although there are, of course, numerous others which would be worth mentioning in each case. However, a few additional potential communicative pitfalls based on these 4 categories are described in the reading passage later on in the module. Verbal communication is of course very complex and includes lots of different aspects. As mentioned earlier, speech acts such as saying hello or goodbye or how you ask for something can vary considerably across cultures. Since this is a very important aspect, the next module will be specifically about critical incidents with respect to such speech acts. Cultures have very different ways to signal politeness. For example, how you address people who are older or have a higher perceived status in society. Languages such as French, Spanish, or German, for example, make a distinction between a formal way of addressing someone, for example, by using vous, usted, or sie, for example, when talking to a stranger, and an informal way of addressing someone, for example, by tu, or du, when talking to a friend. Other cultures, for example in Scandinavia, nowadays prefer to have only one form to address people. There are also very direct and indirect ways how you can ask for something. The more indirect you are, the more polite it is usually perceived. But cultures may have different perceptions how direct or indirect you should be in a specific situation. 2 other fields which may lead to potential problems in intercultural communications are the topics you can talk about and possible semantic differences between cultures. Sometimes a word may sound quite familiar, but may have different connotations in a specific culture. The use of a simple word like friend might be quite confusing for German learners, for example, since it sounds relatively similar to the German expression Freund or Freundin. However, in contrast to English, German indicates the gender. On the other hand, the expression in German can also be used to refer to a boyfriend or girlfriend, respectively. This, of course, also brings up the whole issue of false friends, so words that almost sound alike in both languages, but which have different meanings, like sensible and sensibel eventually, and eventuell, or actually and aktuell. Many cultures have certain taboos, things you shouldn't address explicitly if you do not wish to appear insensitive or rude. Taboo subjects include everything from the use of swearing, discussions on religion, the acceptability of alcohol, or things like death or nudity. These aspects are strongly bound to a culture, and one should not make the mistake of assuming that the attitudes in a specific culture will be similar to one's home culture. Different cultures may view many subjects quite differently to the culture you grew up in. Talking about politics or money issues may be relatively common in German conversations, for example, but these are often considered private issues in normal conversations in the US. So it's usually a good idea to be more cautious in this respect. Quite often we also find several euphemistic expressions within these taboo subjects. Euphemistic expressions are words and phrases that are used to avoid using a more explicit expression which is associated with something rather unpleasant. Common examples are to pass away or decease instead of to die, or the use of the word bathroom instead of the word toilet, which is used in many other cultures, for example in Germany. Paraverbal communication does not refer to meaning itself, but to the way how we convey meaning and how we express emotions while we speak. It includes numerous aspects such as intonation, pitch, volume, rhythm, tempo, the length of pauses we make, or whether or not we laugh or make other extra noises while we speak. For example, in English and in many other languages, we normally use rising intonation to indicate questions, but also to indicate surprise. Falling intonation normally indicates a statement or an order. In some Asian countries, however, polite questions are marked by falling intonation, which might be perceived by Westerners as statements, although this is not the case. This might easily lead to misunderstandings, of course. Cultures may also differ with respect to the length of pauses they make. In some cultures, it's quite common to speak relatively fast. There may be also quite a great deal of overlapping when speakers talk to each other. In other cultures, for example in Scandinavia, the pauses tend to be longer, also between speakers' turns. Volume or loudness may also differ considerably. The loudness in some cultures might be considerably higher than in other cultures. Silence also may have different meanings. In some cases, silence may signal consent, or in other cases, perhaps rather the exact opposite. Speech is usually also accompanied by nonverbal communication, sometimes also referred to as kinesics, which includes facial expressions, gestures, posture, that's the way we stand or sit, how often we make eye contact during conversations, how close we stand to one another, or how often we touch. We often tend to assume that facial expressions are universal, but for example, the frequency and the meaning of smiles may differ from culture to culture as well. Smiling typically indicates happiness, but in some cultures, it may also indicate embarrassment in specific situations. Some gestures are used all over the world and often have the same meaning. There may be differences, however. Individuals in the US use the OK sign, for example, to convey that something is good or acceptable. In Japan, the same symbol may mean money, while in many European countries, for example in France, it can also simply mean zero or nothing. The V sign is also a very ambiguous gesture. When the palm of the hand faces inwards, it has often been seen as a very offensive gesture in many English-speaking countries, for example in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, or Ireland. If the palm faces outwards, however, it symbolizes the victory sign in those countries, which became very popular during the Second World War. It may also simply refer to the number 2 in many countries, and it's also very commonly made by Japanese people, especially younger people, when posing for informal photographs, and is often known as Pisu sign, so the peace sign. As everyone knows who's done a bit of traveling in the world, cultures may also differ considerably with regard to the distance people keep. In any culture, the distance is primarily determined by the fact how well people know each other, but some cultures tend to prefer to have a larger space bubble around them than others. When people invade their personal space bubble, they may quickly start to feel very uncomfortable. Last but not least, extraverbal communication is the final dimension of intercultural communication. The setting of the conversation, that is time and place, might be influential as well. When visiting a church, for example, it's common practice to whisper and not to shout. The general physical appearance and the way we dress can also communicate meaning. Wearing uniforms signals status, for example, in the case of soldiers or policemen. Wearing a robe can signal a special status when a judge is wearing it. But also, in combination with a mortarboard, it may indicate that a student has just graduated from college in Britain or the US. Each culture also has certain cultural scripts. That is, sequences of expected behavior in a given situation. For example, when people attend a funeral or when they go to the doctor. A very common script, which may differ slightly from culture to culture, is going to a restaurant. While the 5 stages, entering a restaurant, ordering, eating, paying, leaving the restaurant, are probably more or less universal. In some countries, it's also common practice that you cannot simply sit down until a waiter approaches you and finds a table for you. In some countries, the waiters will also approach you several times to ask you whether the food is okay or whether you'd like to have more drinks. What can also differ is whether you ask for a bill or whether you just pay when you leave, whether you give any tips, and if so, how much, and so on and so forth. In general, communication is shaped by the individual cultures and can take many forms. Effectiveness of communication often depends on our understanding what these forms might be and how they differ from our own culture. Or as Deborah Tennant once said, cross-cultural communication is like trying to follow a route on which someone has turned the signposts around. The familiar signposts are there, but when you follow them, they take you in the wrong direction.